So I went to this Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo the other day, and the painting that has impressed me the most is probably this, the Base by Hiroshi Nakamura. While not exactly about the war, I think the general feeling and emotions this image evokes matches today's topic very well. And, as we are going into the 10th year of Russo-Ukrainian war and who knows what year of Palestinian struggle for independence, as well as Israel's fight for its existence, the question is more actual than ever. Can we stop wars? This video is going to be in one of the more serious topics, but I feel like we need to talk about it, especially that we live and die in more turbulent times and possibly even more worrying. With the emergence of the new AI and LLM technologies, it might get just a little bit more turbulent, even more, It usually happens when new technologies emerge, but it's the 21st century. I mean, we're not monkeys in the forest anymore, right? Or we're not barbarians that gonna use Stalinist methods. Or are we? We have the wisdom of humankind at the reach of our hand in our smartphones. And with all the challenges our civilization faces today, like access to healthcare, poverty, climate change, do we really have nothing better to do than wage wars? How do we stop wars? Let's try to figure this out. First off, of course you cannot just stop a war, right? Let alone all wars. All parties must agree to a ceasefire at least. That will be probably potentially a first step. But any war has to come to its logical conclusion. Otherwise it will just reignite with new force sooner or later. We see this all the time on examples of Russian war against Ukraine or Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and if ceasefire for one reason or another lasts longer, it's called frozen conflict. This is also quite a common occurrence. We see it, for example, in Moldova, but also in Russian-occupied parts of Georgia, in the North-South Korea conflict, in PRC-ROC, China-Taiwan conflict, essentially frozen civil war. Basically, in this case, the parties are just waiting for the situation to change in their favor so they can win either using warfare again or by diplomatic means, so-called soft power. Unless it's a minor border conflict by scale and number of victims, like Soviet Russia, China, 1969 border clashes, you cannot just give up either. And even in cases like that one, if you do give up, it might have implications for you later down the line, from all the big boys in tight suits in their political games they like to play with human lives. But for me, war is far from being an abstract concept which you can discuss simply sitting in the comfort and safety of my home in Europe or somewhere in the North America. It's something very real, almost tangible thing that my family and friends have to live with every day. And what I'm doing here quite fine, currently here in Japan, some of my friends and family were less lucky and they have to literally fight for their freedom and by extension keeping the rest of Europe safe for now. But if only Ukraine agreed to ceasefire, wouldn't there be peace? Or, in fact, why not just give Russians what they want and finally just have it settled down, no more bloodshed, everything is fine, back to normal, right? You often hear similar variants of this, mostly from European left, but there are also lots of other parties, including my aunt, who is far from being dumb, but who sold her soul working for the Russian military complex. But we'll come back to the topic of traitors in some other video. As for why ceasefires usually don't work, we see it on the example of the Russian-Ukrainian war, where the Ukrainian state being at its weakest point after the revolution in 2014 and having the government, including the president, fled to Russia, the temporary government, under a lot of pressure from some Western countries, mostly from the United States I believe, had to give up Crimea to Russia without a fight. Did it stop the war from happening? Excited by their success in Crimea, which they took with very little blood of Ukrainian soldiers, they tried their luck in eastern and some southern regions of Ukraine. I know exactly what I'm talking about because I watched these events unfold right in front of my eyes, and not just via prism of media, not like some kind of almost like a reality show, but like some people treat it these days. I was in Kiev, I was in the southern regions, I was in Crimea, exactly as the events were happening, and I've seen a lot of things. As I came back to my hometown, I noticed that there were swarms of people going around the city using public transportation, but they didn't know the city at all. They didn't know the street names, they were laughing at the street names, they were asking the locals how to get around. I got approached as well. The most curious part, of course, is that they spoke Russian, but a lot of people speak Russian in Ukraine, but they were speaking a very specific version of Russian, which you would hear normally only in the very specific regions of Russia. And those people would come from Russia to organize and participate in such pro-Russian meetings, and also join the people who genuinely believe that Russians and Putin are the good guys. So I've seen those pro-Russian meetings being organized in cities like Odessa and my hometown Mykolaiv, as Russians further pretended they do not fight the war in Ukraine after capturing Crimea. In 2014 and 15, the Russian soldiers being sent to Ukraine were cleverly taking off their badges, military insignia, which, who's it gonna fool? But It did fool a lot of people, including the locals, unfortunately. And indeed, Russians did not participate to the full extent in the war, like they're doing now. Did not use aviation extensively, outside of airspace in Crimea. But what they did use is everything else, especially they would arrange artillery and MLRS Grad, the rocket launchers, on their side of the border, and then they would shoot into Ukraine. Ukraine could not respond, fearing the real war with Russia. Still, when it looked like Ukraine might regain some territory in the east, Russians stepped in with real reinforcements, forcing Ukraine to negotiate into a ceasefire. Later, those became to be known as Minsk agreements, and this is where we come back to the ceasefire again. Everybody knew from the get-go this is a temporary solution, and while the ceasefire technically worked to some degree, no big advancements were made by either side, the contact line turned into somewhat of a shooting range where Russian snipers and even some TV stars for real would come and use it almost as a shooting range with live Ukrainian targets. And of course, the people who would suffer the most would be Ukrainian civilians, the very same people Russia would be claiming that they are protecting. Ukraine did not have resources or leverage or political will really to regain the territory and save the people from Russian occupation because of all the political fights inside the country, while Russia hoped to use Minsk agreements as a backdoor to sneak in Russian assets into Ukrainian government and parliament to control all of Ukraine. So no matter how many times those independent thinkers, bots and other useful idiots tell you that the West must abandon Ukraine and force Ukraine to negotiate with Russia, what is their real intention? And what is this negotiation going to look like really? Russia is the real aggressor here, and the only thing they are willing to negotiate on is how much land they're going to get that is going to satisfy them for now. There were countless attempts at ceasefires since 2014, and Russians never respected it. All the while, the civilian population suffered the most. But it's not like ceasefires can't be good for anything at all. They might be a useful tool for a specific purpose, like evacuation of civilians, or what Russia is trying to achieve these days in Ukraine, getting rearmed, get their military back in shape, and attack later with new force. And yet, despite regimes like Russia lying constantly all the time, or using one of their favorite tactics, spitting out lots of false information, theories, borderline conspiracy theories, or outright conspiracy theories. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look up how many versions they spit out when they shut down the passenger plane over Ukraine, the MH17. And of course there were people who genuinely believed in the Russian propaganda being dumped into their brains all those years. Some people might not believe Russians, but they see the United States as the empire of evil, which only provokes and starts wars, which, by the way, I'm not saying they don't. They got themselves into a lot of trouble and wars they shouldn't have. But if you see United States and their politics, the modern imperialism, if you will, as your enemy, doesn't mean Russia is your friend. The very same people who are appalled by American imperialism are very frequently just blind to Russian imperialism. And Russians are not even trying to hide it. They're openly saying it on Russian state TV in prime time and in countless Telegram channels, not even talking about bots and private conversations. They are not hiding their imperial ambitions at all. There are billboards all over Russia that say Russians' borders don't end anywhere, and if you need more evidence, just listen to what their state officials have to say on their state TV. They are openly stating they want to capture the entirety of Europe all the way to Portugal. Even the Soviet Empire wasn't as wild. They were at least pretending to be the good guys. Russia doesn't anymore. But coming back to ceasefire or other armistice, it kind of worked for South Korea, you might argue, right? Largely due to a unique set of circumstances, like change of government in the US and death of Stalin. It did work indeed, kind of turning in the longest frozen conflict possibly. And there are signs that North Korea is kind of starting to recognize South Korea these days as a separate entity, so in the future we might see peaceful coexistence here. But yeah, it turned out pretty well, especially for people in North Korea. They're doing well and prosper, right? But it's harder to agree to a ceasefire in more complicated conflicts, like the war in Syria, where there are so many parties involved I couldn't even count them. At least 4 sides that are actively fighting, but definitely more of those who are supporting different factions. And a lot of people actively hate each other. How do you agree on ceasefire there, where it's hard enough already to make 2 parties start fighting? How do you make 4 and more parties agree on something? And in Israel and Palestine, it's even less likely to work due to the nature of borders or lack thereof, but also because of history, culture, historic preconditions, and everything intertwined in a very weird way. And my favorite reason. The bad setup from the get-go in the 40s, mostly by United Kingdom and France who were controlling territories in the region at the time, but also simple lack of incentive, especially for the radical groups that are largely in power. So we can't stop a war with a ceasefire, not realistically at least. So how do we stop a war like this? The right way to stop a war like the war in Ukraine would be to make sure the aggressor loses and to ensure the political change, the regime change, setting up a system of checks and controls so it does not happen in the future. How do I achieve that? Personally, I don't know a better way to achieve it than the military defeat. Warmonger! So when a specific war will be over sooner or later, in one way or another anyway, maybe let's talk how can we prevent wars in the future. If wars are just a part or one of the ways of doing politics, surely we can do politics by other means without resorting to war and violence, right? Well, not quite sure about that. Turning to evolutionary sciences, some might argue it's men, driven by instincts to maximize reproduction. They compete violently for mates, and by extension, new territory. This is about some conscious desire, argue some, for more sexual partners, which manifested itself clearly in the past, like conquering women, getting captives from other villages, that sort of thing. But I think if you look at the macro level at any war probably, you would see a lot of violence happening against women. But I wouldn't argue this would be one of the reasons for starting a war, let alone one of the primary reasons. It's a complex topic, usually there are a lot of factors involved. Money? Come on, it's always about money, right? Staying in power, hello Putin, and often really just a lot of personal issues, trauma, or feeling of greatness, but more so I think it's just in our blood. I like to describe it like this. Imagine our planet as a petri dish, you know, the plastic thing for growing and testing bacteria? When there is enough food and space, bacteria tends to grow and live happily. Two different kinds of bacteria can coexist peacefully. But when the situation changes and food and space become scarce, guess what happens? That's right, they start to compete for resources. And then the more aggressive type, usually the one who reproduces faster or produces antibiotics, wins. So, while some might still argue that including more women in leadership positions might help promote peace, you know, because of their alleged evolutionary focus on raising offspring, leads them to seek stability and lessens the drive for violence. I say, yeah, even if that worked, how do you even do that? Because even if you ban all men from all the positions of power, they still might be influencing politics, even not directly. It's not a historically viable solution either, because, you know, there have been some prominent female leaders out there, and I don't think it led to less war. Besides, what do you do about the other guys who still want to destroy you? Overpopulation is a word a lot of people, but especially politicians and corporations, don't like to hear. But while a big topic on its own, let's talk about it some other time, I think it's a big factor for wars, and I'm afraid it becomes increasingly so. Conflict existed even before we learned to hold a stick. But with resources and, you know, nice places to live getting scarce, I think this is gonna be more and more the real reason for wars. You might say, but hey, there is plenty of space, you might fit a few more billions easily. We sure could, but do you really want to live in a world like that? Would you live in a Sahara desert? There's plenty of space there. Everybody wants to live in nice places like big cities or beautiful nature. So if we want to prevent future wars for real, I think we need to tackle this one. But you know, before that comes around, what can we do? Drugs? There's a documentary called The Sunshine Makers, where a guy from the Brotherhood of Eternal Love tried to drug the entire world, starting with the United States, with acid. As you might imagine, that didn't work. Besides, how do we know that dictators like Putin are not already on drugs? I mean, we're all different. The same substance might make one person a hippie, but it might make another person a complete nutso or maniac. Just look at Mr. Musk and his recent public statements and where his trips with ketamine are taking him. So is there hope? I think stopping war, preventing war, is a part of a bigger struggle of selecting better leaders for our nations. The questions we should be asking ourselves: how do we improve life across the globe instead of treating symptoms, like accepting refugees in Europe instead of, you know, fixing the problem at the source, making the places where people are trying to escape from livable, and not just livable but actually nice to live. My favorite example is probably what you will hear in my channel in the future a lot, is what if an intelligent civilization visited us tomorrow? Let's imagine they would be more intelligent than us, but for the sake of argument, let's say it would be not a super intelligence, just creatures that, you know, got there together. Do we as a civilization even have anyone to talk to them? I mean, who is it gonna be? That UN guy? Wow, and he decides what and is responsible for what exactly? What do we really have to say and show to them? I mean, yeah, we built a couple of space telescopes. Great. But we also built a lot of these for some reason. We got this amazing thing called the internet and built a lot of amazing things. We got this new cool thing we call AI, like ChatGPT and stuff, but what are we using it for? And for generating what exactly? But yeah, let's say we pick two most powerful officials on the planet at the time, and a couple of actually intelligent and educated people to back them up, like a couple of scientists, psychologists, sociologists, just a couple of people who also know a thing or two outside of their very narrow field. And yeah, people that can do more than just, wave and fall down. Even then, what are these people going to say to this intelligent life form from another planet? Well, yeah, we got this thing going on. Alright, there are problems, but what's the plan, Joe? But hey, we are planning to reduce emissions by 0.0001% by the year 2050 if we survive by then, but the other guys have to do it first. I'm not even talking about some kind of long-term plan for development of our civilization. What about just like kind of strategic management for the planet for the next 10 years? I mean, we can't even ban the fucking single-use plastic bag. I'm in Japan now, supposedly a very developed country, but you will not believe how much plastic is being used to wrap a single banana. It's not just even plastic, it's a plastic tray that comes with some of them. Why the duck does it even need the cork-sucking plastic in the first place? So what kind of piece are we talking about if we cannot figure out even this kind of simple problems? And yes, single-use plastics is not a very complicated problem, for the most part. The biggest success of our civilization I've seen so far is probably we've solved the problem of disappearing ozone layer. Among other things like improving medicine and so on, but that seemed like a more real threat to the civilization. I mean, okay, we took care of one thing, well done. Actually, like, really well done, seriously. But what about this other stuff? So, what about AI? Can this be the solution? Possibly, well, I don't know. I think there's one scenario where this can actually help, and it's not really a good one. Honestly, I think it's more likely bad actors who are gonna use it with evil intentions, potentially bringing us to an even worse situation than we currently are in. And this is likely to happen before some kind of general artificial intelligence is going to be able to save us all. There is only one realistic scenario where I can see that AI can help us resolve the war problem, and that would involve some kind of fascist-like regime with the artificial intelligence on top. I mean, the real one, not some kind of ChatGPT, but basically something that would control us, humans. But looking at how things have been going for us so far, honestly, might be not the worst case scenario for us. In conclusion, I don't have a solution. I mean, I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm just some dude on the internet anyway. But we can at least try electing better and smarter politicians that would actually work for our benefit. And if there are currently none, what about bringing someone forward? Sure, in some places you would have to play along these power and manipulation games to do it. In other places like Russia, this full regime change will not work at all. And in more complicated situations, conflicts and places like Palestine, I would really love to see more people like Mohammed Darafshi and comparable people from the Israeli side promoting coexistence come forward and be highlighted by the media instead of more radical elements that are currently in power. I believe politicians with moderate views have to come to power on both sides of the conflict in that region to finally make peace. Otherwise it will take a completely radical spin, like redrawing map of Germany after World War II and migrating people back and forth to prevent future war and violence. As for Ukraine, I will keep on doing my little part to make sure the rule-based world, the world we know that has been established after the World War II, that was somewhat working, somewhat peace, is restored. This needs to happen so that others don't follow Russia's example and don't start new wars again. We don't have a better alternative yet.